Page number 15. Let me start with this. The thing that concerns me the most, I think, is how we look at closing disclosures and what they are and how they're supposed to work. When you issue a closing disclosure, it's supposed to be accurate final numbers in the borrower's hands 3 days before closing. And you can choose to hand deliver these things, you can electronically deliver them, but most of us are mailing them. So today's Thursday, we drop it in the mail on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Monday, it's in hand, Tuesday, Wednesday, next Thursday, we can close. So there's a week between when we drop it in the mail and we're actually going to close the loan. And so if a week is going to go by between when we create the disclosure and actually close, we're not going to be naive. Things can change. And you're going to have instances where you issued a closing disclosure and something has come up to make it be inaccurate between when you deliver it and when you actually close next Thursday, because that's a whole week's worth of time. And so there are a lot of instances where you have to give updated versions of the closing disclosure. But the misunderstanding or misconception that I'm gathering is that there's this belief out there that there is a thing called a preliminary closing disclosure or an initial closing disclosure or an early closing disclosure. And you won't find that in TRID. That's not a thing. Early disclosures, right? Let's just go back here, a little bit of a history lesson. Before TRID, there was a preliminary truth in lending disclosure and a good faith estimate. Those were the earlies, if you will. And then the closing documents were the settlement statement and the final truth in lending. Well, what TRID did is said, well, why do we got to have 4 things? Can't we just have 2 things? And so they made 2 things out of 4. They took the preliminary truth in lending and the good faith estimate, and they combined it together, and that's the loan estimate. That's the early or preliminary disclosure. They took the settlement statement, okay, the HUD and the HUD 1A, and they took the final truth in lending and smashed them together and said, we're going to call it a closing disclosure. That's the final. And so there really isn't supposed to be a preliminary or an early closing disclosure. There's supposed to be the closing disclosure. And so in a best case scenario, you put together a closing disclosure and you deliver it today, and it's the same one that you'll go to the closing table with a week from now. And maybe you slide an updated version of it across the table. You slide a courtesy copy of it across the table with the same date that you delivered last week. If you update the date on the closing disclosure on the day of closing and nothing's changed, you're saying that something's changed. Nothing in any regulation says that you should put an updated date on a closing disclosure where there's no changes from the original one that went out. Because I can tell you this, auditors and examiners, when they see a different date on a disclosure, they're going to go, okay, what changed from this one to the last one? And if you don't tell them that it's the same thing, what they're going to do is go and look line by line and likely find things maybe you don't want them to find, mistakes you hope they wouldn't see. Okay? Whereas if you have it be the same day, oh, that's the same, okay, we're good to go here. And so if it's exactly the same, put the same date on it, it's a courtesy copy, slide it across the table. Now that said, if you've issued a closing disclosure, so it hits the borrower's hands 3 days before closing, so you drop it today, drop it in the mail today on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Monday it's in their hand, and sometime in that time frame before we get to next Thursday, you acquire information that makes what you originally provided inaccurate. Rule number 1 is this. You have to make sure you provide an updated, accurate version 100% of the time. Okay? I'm not even going to get into time frame delays yet. If you've issued a closing disclosure and it becomes inaccurate, you have to provide another one that is accurate. And if that one becomes inaccurate, you'll provide another one that's accurate. You always have to make sure an accurate disclosure has been provided. But be careful with your reference to preliminary, initial, or early closing disclosure. It's not a thing. It's I issued a closing disclosure and I acquired new information that made that previous version inaccurate, so I'm providing another one. But understand that original version that went out was supposed to have been accurate in the first place. When you state that it was a preliminary or an early, I think it's giving people the idea that it doesn't have to be accurate. No, it's supposed to be accurate. And then if it becomes inaccurate, we provide an updated version.